Theodore Roosevelt was president from 1901 until the beginning of 1909. But he became president the first time not by election, but by the death, by assassination, of William McKinley. Theodore Roosevelt was vice president at the time. And Theodore Roosevelt was vice president because he helped start a war. Theodore Roosevelt was one of a small group of individuals who agitated for war against Spain in 1897 and 1898. The war against Spain, the war between the United States and Spain, was triggered by a revolution in Cuba, which at that time was a colony of Spain. And Theodore Roosevelt and a group of like-thinking individuals in Washington and New York thought that the revolution in Cuba afforded the United States the opportunity and the obligation to go to the assistance of the Cubans. The Cubans were trying to achieve independence from Spain. And Roosevelt thought that the United States should assist the Cubans in gaining their independence from Spain. This was in keeping with a long tradition of American support for nationalist revolutions in other countries. The United States itself had been born of a nationalist revolution against the British Empire. So the United States ought to support a Cuban revolution against the Spanish Empire. So this was, call it the altruistic part of Roosevelt's thinking on the subject of Spain and Cuba. Then there was what I could call the self-interested part of Roosevelt's thinking. For the United States to intervene in Cuba against Spain would help the Cuban people, but it would also help the United States, because the United States would remove Spain, which was a declining power but still an important power, from its position right next door to the United States. It is a fundamental principle of international affairs that you don't want strong powers near your border. You want to be surrounded by weak countries, not by strong countries. The weaker your neighbors, the better, because then your neighbors can't beat up on you. They can't threaten you. If you're weak, if they're weak, you can threaten them, but not vice versa. The other thing was, and this was the part of the agenda that Theodore Roosevelt did not share broadly with the people to whom he made this argument for war. Spain had another colony besides Cuba. It had several colonies, but another Spanish colony besides Cuba was the Philippines. Now, the Philippines bears no relationship to Cuba. The Philippines is way on the other side of the globe. But the Philippines was a Spanish colony, and it was strategically located with respect to China. Roosevelt and his intellectual allies were thinking in terms of a larger role for the United States in East Asia. And to seize naval bases in the Philippines would give the United States a leg up. Now, since some of you are writing things down, write this down as another fundamental principle of American foreign policy. The successful foreign policies of the United States combine two aspects: altruism and self-interest. American foreign policy, the ones that have worked, have been good for other people and good for the United States. They have to be good for other people because Americans want the world to think well of us. We like to think that we're doing good things for the world. We're not simply in it for us. And this is an important and very admirable strain in American thinking. But, as Henry Kissinger once said, diplomacy is not to be confused with philanthropy. So it can't be entirely for other people's good. There has to be something in it for us. Let me ask you, the United States has 160,000 troops in Iraq. today. If what I said just now is true, that American foreign policies combine altruism and self-interest, what's the altruistic part of having all of those soldiers in Iraq? How does it serve somebody else's good? Yes?
Frees the people of Iraq.
Okay, frees the people of Iraq from Saddam Hussein's tyranny and promotes, we hope, democracy in Iraq. So this is a good thing for the Iraqi people. And I don't deny it for a minute. Okay, that's the altruistic part. What's the self-interested part? What's in it for us? Yes?
Oil.
Oil, okay? It's not a coincidence that those American troops are in Iraq and not in Sudan, or not in Sri Lanka, or not in any number of other places that suffer similar kinds of misgovernment but don't have oil. So, if you look at nearly any important American foreign policy for the last 200 years, you don't have to look very deeply to find both of these aspects, the altruism and the self-interest. Okay. So Roosevelt says, we've got to declare war on Spain. It took a while for Roosevelt to convince William McKinley, who was the president at the time. William McKinley was a reluctant warrior. He didn't want to lead the United States into war. He had served in the Army during the Civil War. He said, I have seen war. I have seen the bodies stacked like cordwood. And I don't want to go into another war unless we have to. But Roosevelt kept working on McKinley. Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he kept working on McKinley. In fact, McKinley had a Navy doctor. Every president has his official physician. And McKinley's physician was, he's Army, not Navy. He was a colonel named Leonard Wood, who was a good friend of Roosevelt. And every couple of days, Leonard Wood would go up to the White House to check in on his patient, William McKinley. And McKinley would see him coming, and as Wood came up, McKinley would jokingly say, well, Leonard, have you and Theodore declared war yet? And Leonard Wood would say, without breaking a smile, he'd say, no, Mr. President, we haven't, but we think you should. And Theodore Roosevelt was one of the people behind sending an American battleship, the USS Maine, to the harbor in Havana, where it mysteriously blew up, causing a whole lot of Americans to think that the Spanish must have been behind it, creating a groundswell support for war. The U.S. Congress declared war. The United States went to war against Spain, and the first thing it did upon going to war against Spain over the affairs of Cuba was to seize the Philippines. This was astonishing to most Americans. They thought the war was all about Cuba. And they woke up to read in the newspapers, U.S. fleet conquers the Philippines. Most of them had to look on their map to find out where the Philippines was. Well, they found them, and the United States, as a result of this war, found itself in control of the Philippines. And Theodore Roosevelt, deciding to put his money where his mouth was, Theodore Roosevelt had long praised the virtues of warriors and said that the glories of peace pale beside the glories of war. Theodore Roosevelt was too young to have fought in the Civil War, but now he had a chance to win glory in his own war. So he immediately resigned his position in Washington to go fight. Now, this sort of personal commitment is unheard of in American government today. It would be like the number 2 person at the Pentagon, after having helped push the United States into war. I don't know if you remember who it was, but Roosevelt's counterpart was a guy named Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And he held the job that Theodore Roosevelt had held 100 years before. If Paul Wolfowitz had said, okay, I'm resigning as the number 2 person in the Pentagon, and I'm going to go join the infantry in Iraq, you can imagine what a phenomenon that would have been. Well, Theodore Roosevelt was very much the same way. Roosevelt went off to Cuba and covered himself in glory.